This is the Educational Triage Podcast. Welcome. We invite you to come along with us on an exploration of interviews, issues, and other exciting and relevant topics in education, especially alternative education. They say alternative education is a laboratory for mainstream education. Why? Well, join us every week and listen in as Philip Summers
Aloha.
and I, Tony Hunt, jump in feet first to discuss issues that may affect our classes, students, communities, as well as our teaching. Please subscribe if you enjoy and find relevance in what you experience here. And if you haven't left a quick review, please do. We appreciate your candor and insights so we can improve as we move forward. Now, let's see what's on board today.
And Heidi-ho, everybody, and welcome to Educational Triage. This week, we are talking about the roles of institutions and policymakers as well as systems in preparing teachers for alternative education. And to help me do that, of course, we have the lovely, frolicking Philip.
Can't frolic and stay on camera. Aloha.
That's true. Hey, so the components that we're going to cover this week, we're going to look at curriculum development, accreditation and recognition, partnerships and collaboration, professional development opportunities, supportive policies and funding, research and evidence-based practices, professional standards and certification, as well as support and mentorship programs.
Hey, that is a great beat. It's easy to dance to.
Is it? Did I actually do that?
Roll there, and I thought about it. Hey,
I didn't think I had a cadence.
you did.
Oh, excellent. Let's cut to the chase. One of the things, because we are talking about training alternative ed teachers, and we also know that as far as if we're going to talk about educational institutions, we're talking about universities, we're talking about anywhere that there might be some form of training for a teacher. So whether it's on the job training, whether or not it is in the community, somewhere. So universities, the schools themselves, policymakers, we know that fewer than 20% of policymakers actually have ever set foot in a classroom as a teacher and have any teaching experience. And from what I'm gathering from speaking to educators all around, that there are more and more administrators being hired who have absolutely no classroom experience.
Yes.
And this is concerning in a sense. And then educational systems are any one of those systems that would prepare or use or foster training. So an educational system would be a high school. It would be anything that would carry them around. And yes, I said that for institutions, but yes, they can be in both. With curriculum development, let's start with that, because curriculum development seems to be one of the big linchpins, and it's also one of the most, I think it's polarizing, because a lot of institutions, policymakers, they want to, let's get those kids, and they must do what we tell them to do. It's that whole idea of conformity, as opposed to what are the skills and what are the standards that we're trying to get them to learn? What have they already learned? What can they teach us? And how do we create a delivery system that is equitable, that's fair, and that's rich with the content, so that the students can leave with that content somehow or other embedded.
Well, and one of the things I thought about with curriculum development, when it comes to either presenting it or using it curriculum, is that it has to have a lot of depth to it, a lot of bandwidth. We both know from alternative ed that you have to have a lot of flexibility with your curriculum, because you might be teaching somebody in a 7th grade level in a senior kind of junior level, environment, to say the
Hmm.
least. And so you have to appropriately, address that. It's also sometimes tough to get the kid who's really smart. They were the challenge, because it's like, oh, dang, I don't want to hold the kid back. But
Right.
there's so much bandwidth in there. And so when there is that curriculum development, you have to kind of initiate that alternative ed atmosphere, that alternative ed approach. Like, the curriculum has to be really flexible. So if you're developing curriculum that you really want to use for alternative ed, or to train alternative ed educators, it has to sort of have uh, almost a real flexible quality to
You
it.
mean a
Almost
parallel quality in a sense?
kind of
So
like
that,
that. You have to really let it develop with the students.
right. And so you have a parallelism where
Yeah.
if you don't have the requisite skills to be, let's say, an 11th grader, you're losing out on the reading and the writing.
Yeah.
How do I impart that information to you so that you have it while also working with you on those basic skills
Yeah.
that you need?
It's very flexible. You have to have a nimble mind. You have to kind of like juggle abilities. And when it comes to curriculum development and training educators to be alternative educators, you have to work with them almost within a collaborative sense. Like, I've got my ideas of what it's going to be like and how I've done alternative ed, but then again, alternative ed demands that I consider that I have to change, and so you have to collaborate with the students. And so I'm saying it's not so much the content, but the manner in which you develop the curriculum.
And the intent.
Yeah, the intent is and you're actually training them, it would seem to me, the educators. you know you're working with a group of students who want to be educators in alternative ed. You're going, okay, here's the deal, guys, I really need you and you need me, so here's what we're going to do. And they go, well, huh, we've never quite done that before. It's like, oh, welcome to alternative ed and alternative ed training. Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the capstones of that is the parallel kind of curriculum that you have going,
Yeah.
but it's also the remediation. And
Yeah.
you also need to be very adept at universal design for learning, as
Yeah.
well as, I'm thinking Carol Tomlinson,
Mm.
where she talked about the differentiated curriculum. Differentiated curriculum.
Yeah.
And yeah, and just being able to reach the students in whatever format, because what I want to learn about a topic is not necessarily what you want to learn, but I can figure out some different ideas that maybe you want to explore on that, and then we can all come back together and possibly using some of the Kagan concepts. And I don't know that Kagan came up with all of these, but the cooperative learning, we can jigsaw and we can come up with a meatier piece of knowledge. So let's say that we're talking about, I don't know, let's say that we're talking about immigration, and you bring in causes of why people come over for immigration.
Mm.
Somebody else takes on, how do we handle immigration? What's going on with that? And somebody else may take something else. I mean, they all have different components, so we can teach each other,
Yeah.
but we're all learning.
It's the foundation, I think. It's becoming an alternative ed educator by behaving like an alternative ed student and
Right.
educator. Yeah, I wish I'd had that in my classes. Hey, let's get together and develop this and create something together. Like you said, something about immigration. It's much more interesting.
Right, because you don't know how many of your students actually have those stories
Right.
inside their own families, inside their walls. Back in the day, years ago, there was a project. It was a project-based learning kind of thing that was rolled out, and we were using it with ELL students. but they also wanted to do it with regular ed students. And it was teaching students about their own backgrounds, about where they came from, so they could learn more about their own heritage, and they could learn some background about who they are and where they come from,
where they fit,
and what are their traditions, if they have any. So they're not devoid of context. And I brought a little bit of that in. We were doing the Pearl, and I was working primarily with Russian students and Latino students. And so they came in and they were all telling me all these stories that their families were telling them. And I said, "You didn't know that?" And they said, "No." And my parents were so pleased because we had never asked. And I thought, wow, because in my family, my parents used to tell us about things.
Yeah.
So, but, different strokes for different folks, right? I mean, sometimes you have to ask. I've learned so much, and just the stories of the students. I had one student who talked about crossing the border and being snuggled up to the engine because they had a coyote who brought them up to the border, but they were in trucks. And so he was in the engine. He was right next to the engine, which was really hot. So they patted him, but it was really, really hot. And he was really young. And then they made it over, and his parents were thankful that he survived.
Oh.
But
he smuggled in the engine.
Yeah, they were all smuggled in. And so you hear these stories and you wonder how that would have been had I been him, or would I do that with my family to get a better life?
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about when you were speaking about that was giving out a questionnaire to students. And then I thought to myself, it would kind of shock other students to see this, but it's appropriate. Have you ever, been in a war zone? Or have you been a refugee?
Right.
And because that's not the kind of question you're going to ask people really first.
I don't know that I would ask students that if they wanted to come forward with something like that, because I don't want to bring up trauma.
Well,
that's why I say they go home.
You're not the one that's going to bring it up. In fact,
but if you ask them those questions,
and maybe verbally,
if you ask them those questions, you're going to bring it up. I just wanted them to go home and ask their parents, tell me some stories.
It's like, raise your hand if you've ever,
No.
With a coyote. It's like,
no.
Some kids might not do that. Some kids might go, hey, let me tell you. Ooh.
No, you're always surprised by what they're willing to share with you.
But I do want to know about the kid themselves too, and that's why we give out that questionnaire, sort of
right.
Confidential. I really do. I mean, if you've gone through some trauma that most people sort of sit on and put underneath the surface, don't share with the teacher. I'd kind of like to know about it, if for no reason but to respect you and that what I would perceive to be that boundary, just sort of, I understand that that's a rough time.
There's something else that I don't think people actually understand, because I also used to be a consultant with the Migrant Education Project.
Yeah.
And what people don't understand is that it was either in 1966 or 68. There was an act passed by Congress. And if people came to this country and they wanted an education, it doesn't matter if they're legal or illegal. You cannot share any of those records with the immigration services.
Mm-hmm.
Immigration service, there is a firewall between education and educational services and the immigration.
Yes, there is.
So anybody in a school who reports illegal immigrants is violating federal law. So if they're acting on behalf of the school,
mm-hmm.
and if they're a worker at the school, and they report that, then there's no other way that they would know it.
Right.
So that's that's something that nobody actually knows, or else they're just not aware of it. But here, let me throw out some other things that in my notes that I have on this.
Please.
And I think you're right, because we need a creative, supportive environment for teachers to be able to create these curriculums.
And create new approaches to the curriculum.
That's right. We need to be innovative.
Hatching the ideas as soon as you're training. Yeah.
So when we have people who are more comfortable putting kids in front of a screen and having people just yap at them, and they have to have a certain number of hours in order to pass a certain number of credits without really gaining any knowledge,
right,
simply because those people are accredited. Check with your state alternative education liaison and check the laws. I know that in Oregon, if you are adjunct to a high school where over 50% of the staff are highly qualified, you yourself do not have to be highly qualified, but you still need to be held accountable for what you teach. Mm-hmm. So if you are not comfortable teaching something, you say so and have somebody else who is comfortable and knows what they're teaching teach it. So
you were saying earlier, go ahead, sorry.
Well,
I wanted to add a point that was set up. You brought up earlier, we were talking about administrators. 20%, I think was a figure that of the administrators are the ones that have been in the classroom.
No, that's policymakers. It's fewer than 20%. It's closer. It's between 15. It's actually probably less than 15%.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. My point's this, though, that the difference between those that know and don't know is the difference between those that have done and not done. Simply because you can't know what you don't know. If you've never operated, if you've never taught, if you've never done the thing that you're supposed to oversee or make enough understanding of to make policies for, you've never done it enough to understand what you don't know, then you're going to miss so much. And that's this, like the curriculum development. If you had an instructor that stood in front of the class and said, this is how you do alternative ed, you do it this way, and that's your model. Once you get out of the classroom, you'll go, okay, but how does it work? But if you start to behave in an alternative education way while you're training to be an alternative educator, then when you get out there, you already have done and you know something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the true thing. A lot of administrators didn't teach. They never taught. And I thought to myself, that makes no sense. You just don't know what I am or what I do. You just don't.
They need to let go of the micromanaging and all the control. They need to let it happen. It will happen if you have a good set of teachers.
That's why you're a teacher. I was hired to teach. I mean, I'm a professional.
Wait. And I'm going to throw this out because we got a lot to get through. And I was reading through some things online, and I noticed different teachers were talking about why they became teachers. And they were saying things, I want to do this because I want children to feel safe. That's why I went into teaching. And I thought, that's not a real reason to go into teaching. And somebody else said, I want to stop bullying. That's my primary goal as a teacher. That was why I went into teaching. And I thought, that's not why you go into teaching. You go into teaching to, 1, teach kids, 2, to help them, 3, to build them up, 4, to give them a brighter future with what it is that you are teaching them. It all falls in line. You don't go in there to stop bullying. You've just thrown
the ABCs.
You've just taken the cart and the ox, and you have thrown them into the river and told them,
in a tornado,
get to the town as soon as you can.
Yes.
But where's the town?
Oh God, it's just
So okay.
We're talking about that. If you know the content of something, that's not enough. And if you teach your content and you can't teach it in a way that people get it like you do, like you can't share with them your enthusiasm for that content, then you're just not a teacher, and you should just find something else to do. You may love doing what you do with science or math or literature, but if you can't exhibit that gut, I love to learn, period, and this is what I really love to learn about, and get people involved even if they don't like it initially, then you're not a teacher.
Well, you are a teacher. You just don't have the right delivery system.
Yeah, you just don't have the skills to. Yeah, you may be great at the content, you're just not sharing it so well. So
Right.
those that can't teach, you just do.
So, from the institutions, the policymakers, and the systems,
Yeah.
what they should be also providing, aside from networking opportunities that they should be providing, they should be giving funding research on effective teaching practices and alternative education.
Mhm.
But here again, when we talk about funding research on good alternative practices, we don't. Now you're taking it back and you're making it into more of a compliance kind of thing.
I was going to say
Everybody to be going in lockstep, and that doesn't work.
Yeah,
What you might have are what are some of the best practices and what are some of the best ideas, but a lot of those are organic and they're homegrown.
yeah.
And so you have grassroots schools that are doing amazing things. And so you can do that. You might take some of the Waldorf or the Sudbury ideas. You just need to be exposed to all those different pedagogies and all those ideologies. Professional development opportunities, we're going to get into that, collaborating with other teachers and stakeholders and creating a supportive and inclusive environment for teachers in an alternative setting so that they feel valued and supported, and not like the back room where you toss things and close the door and walk away and you have absolutely no involvement. And once in a while you poke your head in to make sure that it's still there, and you might rifle around, but other than that, you really have no involvement with it whatsoever.
Yeah, the true problems come when they disrespect your classroom and then they'll insert a student that just disrupts the entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't support you. They go, look, this kid's bad at the high school. We want him over there. You just take him. And it's like, yeah, that doesn't give me any regard, nor does it give the other students any regard.
There was nothing worse than when we would have a gaggle of administrators walk through our classroom while we were trying to teach and work with students. And we had some students watching some videos, some educational videos, or they might, I can't remember what else they were doing. Some of them just needed to be away and they just needed to have some space away from other people. Yeah. And they were working, maybe they were testing in our conference room, and the administrators came in and said, we booked this room. Your kids need to leave. Aside from the other conference rooms and the other empty rooms in the building, it just had this air of asserting dominance.
Was it booking the room because they were working with your program?
No, it had nothing to do with our program.
Oh, it was just the room.
It was, okay. But it was our room, and it was a cool room.
Yeah. It was. Yeah, it's that's your turf. And that kid was in there, because they wanted to be alone and work in silence. And yeah.
Right. And it was our conference room because, we had meetings in there with different businesses. We had meetings in there with students where we did student training. There were a number of reasons. We did our interviews for them.
That would be that. Yeah, I would. Mm-hmm. And so many reasons why you would make it your room because it's
right. But they decided that it was in their best interest to assert their influence. Okay.
Well, that's the difference, isn't it?
Right. So how are you supporting technology and integrating technology and not going whole hog on technology, using evidence-based practices? And by evidence-based practices, that doesn't mean database practices. It's what are practices that actually get the kids up and excited and doing and moving through what they're going to be doing. And maybe there is data that works with that. But
it's really important not to get too data driven, because eventually what starts to occur is the result starts to drive what you put back in. So the data you want becomes the data you focus on, which limits the educational process. And that's what I saw happen when it came to when the standards went through. I have nothing against standards, but when they went through, the focus was so intent on them. A lot of electives, a lot of resources that I used went away. It was like the cart slowly moved in front of the horse.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that was what students needed in order to have their social emotional learning. If they don't have that, then they don't have an outlet.
It was
and so
classroom result atmosphere in the last 15 years.
But we have these government funded programs now that we have to use because they're government funded and they know better rather than what worked well in the past.
Yeah.
And I knew something bad was going to happen. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah.
Accreditation and recognition.
That's interesting. Accreditation.
So, accreditation. Now, here is something that, and this would have to do with training programs. Now, what the notes that I took, what I discovered was that they were pushing for a national standards for alternative ed. And a national registry of alternative educators. Here's the problem. Every state creates their own standards and practices for teacher licensing.
Correct.
It's not national. Yes, there is a national certification. Do we really want to have a national accreditation?
No.
For alternative education?
No, I don't. It's hard enough to get people to agree from coast to coast, as long as you're going in the correct direction and you're adhering to the state standards.
Because nationally, they want to put everything into the same hole.
Yeah, and they can't even find the hole. I mean, I don't trust a national registry of anything. First off, it's a political awfulness. So.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, dig a ditch, and then where does it go to? I don't know, we're just digging a ditch.
Right. But what each state should do then is figure out clear and rigorous standards for teaching preparation programs in alternative education. What would some of those standards be? What would you want? Do you want somebody who's there to stop bullying, or do you want somebody who loves kids and who can and who has a passion for what they're doing? I know that when I interviewed for my one job and I came to my last district, my future boss was interviewing me and she bumped into one of my colleagues from my other job and they were good friends. And I had no idea that they were good friends. In fact, the other one called me and said, I didn't know. And she said, is he really that crazy that he likes these kids? Or is there something mentally wrong with him? And the mutual friend of ours said, oh no, he loves working with these kids. He just loves them. And they love him back. And so that got me my job. But it's because I taught what I felt was appropriate and what I wanted to learn and bring them along with me. And so we could all learn together.
That's exactly how I think.
Exactly. Yeah. So, of course, I mean, I looked at some of my kids and I said one time, okay, I want you each to pick an animal and I want you guys to find out these certain things and I want you to write a paper about it and I will lead you on how to write a paper about it. And a year later, one of the kids who had graduated, he called me up and said, can we meet for coffee? I said, sure. We went out. He said, you're the one who taught me all about whatever it was that he chose. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I said, really? He said, I didn't know all these things before. It wasn't about the paper. And they all finished writing the paper and they did a good job of it. But they were getting into being able to have the freedom and the liberty to choose what it was that they were going to write about.
Yep. It wasn't you who taught him everything. It's him who learned it all.
Right. And so that's what we are. We're a guide. We're a facilitator.
Yeah, happy to help. I had no idea it'd be that significant an assignment for you, but I'm always trying.
Right. And so that was part of my training, though, was having that realization. And if you're not still training while you're learning alternative ed, then the spark is gone. You might as well go back to mainstream ed for a little bit. Because I think that the burnout rate for alternative ed is high simply because there is no support, there is no recognition, and you're constantly fighting these tropes.
Yeah, that's exactly it. They're seeing it as a disciplinary program, and you're trying to teach, and it's like, wait a minute here.
Right. So how do we develop a process for teacher preparation programs in alternative ed? And who would be overseeing it? Well, that's the rub. You have to have people who know what they're talking about. You can't just grab somebody and say, okay, you're in charge of this, because it all becomes very political. And then you see people already at the departments of education who roll their eyes, and they have to go through different processes and everything. So there has to be something.
It's a huge change.
And then
I have the feeling if you started to propose, construct, present an alternative education program standard, set of standards, I think you'd run into some people who would just fight you on the basis of you can't change things like that. You can't do that.
Right, but those are the people that you don't want around you.
Yes, it's true. But those are the people that some of them making the decisions. It's like, whoa, we can't do that. It's like,
well, who made them God, and who told them that they even knew what they were talking about?
Well, someone who voted them in or appointed them or something, and all of a sudden you're going, oh, God. Well, again, we're dealing with a policymaker who has little or no experience in education. What did I know about it? They do. They're the policymaker. It's like, oh, it's like you go home and bang your head against the wall and then go in and smile and go, my day's over.
Right. And so figuring out an advocacy, and that's where the state and the national organizations for alternative ed.
We really do need that. And that support, like you said, there's so much burnout. It's really, it's the way to go. And just, it's not the way, not the only way, but it's one of the ways to go that is very valid.
Mm-hmm.
That's why.
Okay. Partnerships and collaboration. So how do we work with other people? How do we learn with them? I think I mentioned last week that we used to have the colleague college where we would teach each other something. There was some new skill that we were going for. And that was also down under professional development. But how do we create a professional learning community? And who are these people that are willing to work with us? If there are alternative educators that you work with who aren't willing to do it, that's fine. Leave them in the dust. I feel sorry for the kids. It's a huge red flag to me that they're unwilling to do it. And if they're always looking for excuses. But where are some of the other people that you can hang with who might be there? We had an incredible alternative ed teacher who came to us, and he said that he was being micromanaged by the mainstream education.
No.
And he fought back and said, let me do what I do, and then you'll see the results. Just leave me alone. And they said, well, we can't do that because we don't know what you're doing. And he said, well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, he just needed to get away from the micromanaging. So he came over, he interviewed with us, we hired him, and he was magic because he would tell the kids stories and he had them wrapped around his fingers and they would work for him. And they did so much. And so he and I would collaborate and we would do a lot, and I would work with other teachers, but I couldn't get the other schools and programs to do what we were doing because they were so set in their ways of the kids will sit in front of the computer and they will do it that way.
Here's a shout out too, though, to both mainstream educators and alternative ed educators regarding the colleague college and the professional learning communities, PLCs. I think that most of those people would be wildly in favor of dedicating that time to it, and they're just not given any time to do it because of everything else that's been piled onto teachers. It's sort of like, I'd really love to do it, but I'd also love to go to my son's, Little League game or something. It's almost like they don't, or not even that, but they don't even put it within the day. The support is missing for that kind of thing all across the board. And
it needs to be ingrained in the professional development days.
And even so, they should be increased and sort of focused, But yeah.
Well, what they have us do, and if any of you have a different experience, let me know. But they make us go to the mainstream classroom teacher professional development, which has very little to do with what we're working on. It's nice to know what's going on with your rooms, but in our rooms, we're doing things differently. And so I used to get in trouble and people would say, you need to be paying attention. And it's like, none of this has anything to do with us.
Exactly.
I am bored out of my mind.
Oh, it was some places you heard an airing of grievances from like high schoolers against elementary schools and back and forth. I'm like, what the heck is this? You're totally wasting my time. Meanwhile, I'm chopping at the bit to get back to my classroom to get my stuff straight for the beginning of the year.
But the thing is that if you've got good ideas and if you have a state organization, there's a conference and you can share there. But if that's what you're limited to, if your state organization can have small regional meetings and people can do something there and you do something maybe once a quarter, that's a way of doing it. And you can share, you can boast, you can brag.
It's interesting if you think about it. We're always talking about good teachers learn and they teach, and it's sort of balanced, right? And the way the system is set up, like teach is just totally heavy. They never give you that time to collaborate or learn or to partner or just do stuff. It's always, this duty, that teaching duty, this duty. And pretty soon there's no time to learn. Like the colleges were wonderful. Yeah.
Right. And what ended up happening was they did create professional learning communities in our building. Yeah. We weren't part of it. We were kept out of it, but they were micromanaged.
That was a problem.
And so here is what you will do in your professional learning community. And this is what you will discuss.
Here's your agenda. And it's like, wait a minute. And who came up with this agenda? What's the process for that?
Right.
Yeah.
Then and so, so there was nothing that was shared. It was all, I like that word, contrived.
It was contrived.
Okay. So let's transition now into professional development opportunities. So for many alternative educators, that would mean going off campus and meeting with other alternative educators, either in your district, in your community, in your state. That would mean that you would have funds for travel. If you needed overnight, they would need to provide those for you. And what kinds of resources do you have? But this means that your administration actually gives a shiz about your program and about your students.
Yep, they do. That's true.
And you need the board too. How do you create training programs? Start thinking about who are the new people that are coming in, and maybe with other people, you can start creating a training program that you could connect with the universities or colleges that have training programs, and you can talk to them about how do you implement those. I used to go in and give workshops at the colleges and the universities, And I was amazed at how many students wanted to go into alternative ed, but they said, how do we get into it?
You get lucky.
Yeah, you do.
Another thing too about ProDev is that it's not just limited to education and educational theory. Yeah, sorry, professional development. I also took courses on flow state, and how it works. And I took a course on meditation and mental practices, and from a Navy SEAL, no less. Really useful course.
So in other words,
it was
enrichment courses for yourself.
Right. Well, but then I obviously, as what I love to do, is share what I've learned. I shared it. I incorporated it. I actually taught flow state directly. What the hormones do and how they do it, and how the results of it, and it's pretty exciting. Of course, we've done crazy stuff and filmed it on flow state, but yeah, it's just learning what learning is, and learning how we learn and how the brain works can be nothing but beneficial. And I've really incorporated a lot of that. So I guess I was kind of being alternative, but yeah.
Right. And I think that we also need to get rid of the notion that every kid needs to graduate on time.
Oh, well, yeah, that was gone. For me, that's a big relief. But you're right, absolutely right.
And that goes with pacing, but
yeah,
it also works towards creating a more efficient curriculum.
Yes.
So if somebody has that magic that you can put in and you can try and develop, because if you can just do it the first day and all of a sudden you have magic, you're already doing it. You have to develop these things because you have to make them your own. And a lot of people don't understand that. They think that they can just try something and it's going to magically work. But of course, it has to be on your own, because you are your own person. And so you are the magic in one sense, as well as delivery.
Right. But if you have that, the charisma, that energy behind it, anything can be taught and get to anything else. When I was teaching flow state, for example, I was teaching biology, neurobiology, and making it, just getting to it through that subject. I felt good about that. It's like, because they're hard subjects.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but we're looking at improved student outcomes, right?
Yeah, always, aren't we? I mean,
and we want the students to be successful. If that means the kid's there for another 3 weeks in September, the kid's there for another 3 weeks in September. You may have to do some weird tango with the kid in order to get him to come back for the 3 weeks, but then they are done. But you also need to be sure that you give yourself the time off so that you're not constantly working. It's such a high burnout rate in alternative education for a very good reason.
There's a bunch of reasons. Yeah.
So, but you're going to have a stronger program. You're going to be a more effective teacher. And so start looking for those. Next one, supportive policies and funding. And this is a wrinkle. Supportive policies. When you have a school district or an administration who refers to the students as those kids, and you should have no qualms about looking at them when they say the kids in alternative ed, and you just look at them and you say, no, you mean our kids. They are all of our kids in alternative education.
Good point.
They are not those kids. Don't other our kids. Correct them. They may not like it, but they know that you're right. But you need to be able to get policies and funding, because alternative ed tends to be the most underfunded. They tend to have no policies, and if they are policies, they are punitive by nature.
restrictive.
Yes.
The
And
thing
they
is,
do.
too, that you're starting from an expensive standpoint anyway. Alt Ed is expensive.
For a very good reason.
Exactly, for
Because
a good reason. Yeah.
when you have to remediate that number of students
Mm-hmm.
and you are specialized, you don't even need special ed involved if you're doing your alternative education properly, because you're already doing special ed. It's already baked into the program, into what
From
you're
my
doing.
years of experience, I can absolutely agree with that. I never needed special ed. I became special ed. I liked some of the things that was told, like work on this or work on that. That was helpful. But as far as like having a special ed department, no way. I mean, I didn't need it.
Mm-hmm.
We are special ed. I mean,
Right.
Everyone's on an IEP.
So
Yeah.
this is where the policymakers come in, as well as the administration
Yeah.
and the school boards. So they need to start advocating for policies that support the special education. That means provide funding for alternative education programs, create supportive regulatory environment,
Adequate.
ensure that they are adequately funded. But we know that schools are not adequately funded, even though most states have the constitutional liability. It's baked into the Constitution that the schools will be fully funded, but they always don't do it.
I know, it's like, yeah.
And why people don't hold them to task for that, I have no clue. But you also have to have supportive regulatory environment, including flexibility in program design and implementation, as well as policies that protect the rights of students and the families.
Yeah.
Supporting legislation, providing funding. It could be at the state level. You might even be able to take it at the federal level. I don't know where you live or what little strings you can pull, but how do you advocate for changes to existing regulations or for the development of new regulations? A lot of that can happen within your state organization.
And should.
Yes. And then providing data. Because what we noticed in a predominantly white suburban district was that the majority of the minority kids were going into alternative ed because it was safer. And the number of white kids was diminishing. And the minorities were succeeding.
Oh yeah.
And they just felt more at home there. They felt they could be themselves.
Yes. That, they were talking about that too, is a big deal in our district. There's too many kids of color in alternative ed, but they were looking at it from the wrong standpoint. You're looking at it like it's a disciplinary thing. I'm kind of thinking a lot of them, we actually get like little sisters and little brothers. You know what I mean? They want to be there. It's like, it's not because they're being sent here so much as it's also because they don't feel comfortable in mainstream high school. Well, the question, instead of looking at it and saying, why are there so many minority students going to alternative ed? Right. The question should be, why do our minority students feel more comfortable going to alternative ed? What are we not doing in our hallways, in our classrooms, in our building to make them feel welcome, wanted, and needed? With the right kind of eyes, you can see the question clearly. Yeah. They saw it as a problem. I'm thinking, no, I think these kids are just smart. But there are places where they have implementation of supportive policies, of supportive funding. And they have improved student outcomes. They have increased teacher effectiveness and program quality. The program I left, it was international. They were flying between all the states
and overseas to the UK to implement the exact same program. And yet, 50 years later, when we celebrated that, not one administrator showed up, except for the building principal. The superintendent didn't show up. None of the school board members showed up. Nobody. Even though they had been invited, there were press releases that went out. And what does that tell you about our current state of education? That an alternative program of 50 years, 51 now, does not deserve the recognition from a school board and a superintendent who tout how precious and important students are.
Yeah.
It's because they aren't the right kind of students.
Getting run over by the big gray truck.
Yes. Okay, so we're getting on a roll here. Research and evidence-based practices.
That's my curriculum. Everything was always like, first it was implemented, and then it was like, well, that didn't work so good, or hey, that worked great, I should expand on that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think that if you look at the NAEA, if you look at the rubrics for holding alternative programs accountable, that those are there. Yeah. Because what you do, you're working off of the standards, correct? Yeah. You just have a different way of doing it. And this is nothing new. It's the same thing that's been done for years.
Yeah, the standards are there. And yeah, I mean, it's, and your methods always need to be adjusted. Even if they're dialed in, they're not dialed in the same next year or whatever. It's right. Everything's dynamic.
And you get this through the PLCs. You get it through professional development opportunities. You get it through people who care, through going and talking to people and doing your research and having the time to do all this. So basically what's happening is we have front-loaded almost everything that we're talking about with examples, but everything is, I'm just going to use it, incestuous in many ways, because everything just kind of melds and it all works in great synchronicity.
That's what teaching is.
Even despite your administration, it can be synchronous.
So it can.
So you have improved student outcomes, teacher effectiveness, and program quality. Now, standards and certification. We already talked about it. We talked about this towards the beginning.
Yeah, we're not
and do we need a national board that oversees education? And so states would go to that. And I'm thinking, why would we do that when that's like saying every district will do the same kinds and every program will do everything lockstep. And exactly. That doesn't work. We know that. Every family doesn't work that way.
Right. It's the antithesis of what we're
right.
after.
And so it made me wonder. And so maybe that's something we can talk about at a later time.
Yeah, I'd love to, because that's like...
Yeah. And now we're finally at support and mentorship programs. So this, again, we need to have, this is student teaching. How often are alternative education programs kept off of student teacher lists? It's very rare to have, the only way I ever had a student teacher was if one of my assistants needed to do their student teaching.
Yeah.
Because student teaching is mentorship. It is mentorship.
Yeah. When I got out of, when I went to graduate school and I did my mentorship in a mainstream high school, big one, I did not visualize anything about my career other than going to another big high school, I didn't want to going into Mr. Summers' room and, like I do when I substitute now. Then I get hired and I get into alternative ed, and it's just kind of like, what the heck is this? And then I started changing, and fortunate for me, I got that job. I had no idea. I mean, I just thought schools were schools. I didn't know what an alternative
Right. And a lot of times you have people who are absolutely resistant.
There were some people that just quit. I know a couple I ran into lived in their career like 6 months and they were gone. They just fled. This is not at all what I expected, and I can't deal with these kids, and I can crying kind of thing.
Well, there again, it has to do with what's your intent in teaching.
Yeah, I don't know what her deal was. She was just overwhelmed by the environment.
Overall, everything that we've talked about tonight, it's frustrating because it could be there, but there's just that, I don't know, I have that je ne sais quoi of what it takes to knock some sense into the administrators, into the school boards. So join us next week when we discuss the importance of integrating alternative education principles and practices into teacher training programs. So until then, Philip, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
And to everybody else, have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.